Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us for an info session for the Columbia Climate School's non-degree programs. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Columbia Climate School, we are going to be the first new school at Columbia University in 25 years. The school was announced back in July 2020. And the new school is really meant to draw on the university's strengths in the areas of climate and sustainability, and building capacity to form a hub of existing and world-class research centers and programs. This encompasses the Earth Institute and all the research centers that are a part of the Earth Institute. And we're excited to be offering our non-degree programs. Specifically, today you're going to hear about our professional learning workshops and the workshop that Dr. Arthur Lerner-Lamb will be teaching this fall, titled Harnessing Capital for Climate Solutions, Science, Sustainability, and ESG. Just to give you a quick overview of our professional learning workshops, these are non-credit workshops, so no transcripts, open enrollment, and really meant for professionals who are working already in a field with an interest in climate and sustainability. And these are taught by the same instructors who participate and teach in our degree programs. Dr. Lerner-Lamb teaches in our Sustainability Science Master's program at the School of Professional Studies. And these workshops are meant to be flexible. There is no homework. We will provide suggested readings, and we will record all of the course content and lectures. These sessions will be fully remote this fall, and participants receive a certificate of participation from the Climate School at the end of the workshop with the number of hours, as well as the title of the workshop that was completed. These are fee-based workshops, and we do have reduced rate options available for former participants of the workshops, Columbia affiliates and alums, or if you work for a government agency or nonprofit organization. If you'd like some more information about that, feel free to contact me directly. You should all have my email by this point. So I will turn it over to Dr. Lerner-Lamb to talk about his particular workshop, which is going to be exploring how basic research in climate and the environment can be used to provide a framework for capital allocation decisions. So Art, take it away.
Thank you, Cassie, and welcome everybody. And thank you for joining us this evening or afternoon. Again, wherever you are, that's one of the advantages, I suppose, of being online. So my name is Art Lerner-Lamb. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Climate School Dean. I've been at Columbia now for 37 years, starting out as a seismologist. And for the last 25 years or so, I've been working in the area of natural hazard risk reduction, and more recently, in the last 10 years or so, dealing with colleagues in our business school, our School of International Public Affairs, and others to really explore how other resources could be used to try to find solutions to some of the environmental crises, natural hazard resiliency, and fundamentally the climate problem as we're going forward. One of the things that has happened recently, and I think most of you have probably taken note of this, and we certainly have, is what we call the Great Pivot. In fact, we had an event last week with that title. This is the notion that public awareness coupled with awareness in the private sector and in governments around the climate problem has accelerated and amplified to the extent that there's a pivot in the way we're thinking about treating the climate crisis. How will we actually deal with it? Basically, it means that we've essentially accepted the notion that we have an environmental problem with climate. We have baselined the understanding across the various sectors of our economy, of our society, that there is a problem that needs to be solved. Now the question is, how do we go about solving it? When we look at the things that we need to do for climate, for example, we're talking about an expenditure of money. And we had a visit by Mark Carney, Senior Advisor to the UK government, former World Bank Chief Economist last week, where there was this discussion of how much it'll actually take. And the numbers range from about 80 trillion to 160 trillion over time, obviously, to come up with the solutions to change society from a fossil fuel burning or fossil fuel dependent society now and an economy now to less dependent, carbon neutral, or even carbon negative economy and society sometime in the future, and hopefully by 2050. 160 trillion is a large number, 80 trillion is a large number. And the point of that is that it's larger than what governments can provide. In fact, if we look at the total bill for what it will take, around 75% of that has to come from the private sector, according to some back of the envelope calculations. And so the private sector is in fact taking notice. It's taking notice in two ways. One is that this change is inevitable in some way. We will either have greater enhanced risk due to climate variability and weather extremes, just to take an example, and we will be making investments in new technologies, emergent technologies, disruptive technologies, new systems that present opportunities. So we just call those climate risks and climate opportunities. And this notion of risk is one of the ways, of course, in which investment decisions are made. But the notion of opportunities also is one of the areas in which investment decisions are being made. So we're talking about this great pivot toward a private sector investment climate, if you will, an environment of investment, an ecosystem of investment in which we're putting or changing the way we allocate capital resources to enhance and build on climate solutions. The externalities to that are going to be government and international policies. They're going to be market factors and so on. So it's not an easy decision. It's going to be a very complex decision. So we're exploring that in the climate school. We're exploring it from a theoretical point of view, from an applied research point of view in our educational programs. And we have in fact been doing that for about 10 years, but now is the time to really begin the action. As I said, it's a great pivot. It's a watershed moment, and we are beginning to interact much more heavily with the private sector on how we actually look at these things. So we decided to work through a curriculum for this workshop, which we, as Cassie said, was entitled Harnessing Capital for Climate Solutions, Science, Sustainability, and ESG, to begin to explore with you the ways in which we should be thinking about this great pivot. So let's begin with risks. A risk is a common metric for decision making. It underlies a lot of decisions, whether you buy car insurance, fire insurance for your home, what kind of investments are riskier than others, and so on. How is that risk measured? And what we're doing and working with the private sector, particularly the financial services sector, is showing how the spectrum of risk that is included in the decision cultures is being expanded in a very quantitative way to deal with climate and weather related risks in various ways. And we talk about a risk taxonomy. This is one of the sessions. We'll have a discussion of what risk actually means. First of all, from sort of an engineering perspective, a scientific perspective, but then how does that map into the actual decisions that people made, how they make the decisions? So from a quantification of risk through risk perception to decision making, how does that all work together? And we'll be exploring that in a number of our sessions. We'll apply that to climate and weather risk in particular, but we'll talk more generally about natural hazards as well. And so the standpoint will be, how do you reduce the risk, say, of a portfolio in order to satisfy your risk metrics, as it were? How do we take into account risks so that investments can be more socially responsible with respect to the returns that you try to get, or that we try to give to the people who actually buy these investments, who participate in the stock markets or the bond markets, for example? How is that done? And so again, we'll be mapping the way the basic research that tells us what these risks are in climate and weather and natural hazards, and mapping that into the decision culture for investments. That's risk avoidance, risk reduction. Now, what about the opportunities? There's this notion, of course, that we're doing a lot of technological innovation, that there are new products, new ways of thinking about sustainable manufacturing, new manufacturing processes, and of course, the whole transition to a low carbon energy driven economy where we are investing in solar, in wind, in new applications of biology, and so on. How is all this working together? What's the new battery technologies? Some of these technologies will be disruptive, and some of them are going to be emergent or incremental in some way. And we'll go through some of those technologies that are sort of on the horizon, being developed. What are university research labs doing? By the same token, everything that we do to reduce carbon, frankly, can't do enough, because we have to extract carbon out of our ecosystem, out of our environment in some way. So we'll talk about things like direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, carbon sequestration, and where is the technology on that? What are the opportunities that we see? Are these opportunities scalable? Can they be commercialized and so on? Again, all those technologies, again, are sort of on a pivot as well, because in fact, these things are beginning to see primary investment, fundamental investment in how they're developing. And we expect that to rise. And we'll go through some of the trends in the electrical car, in the electric vehicle market and so on, as you have no doubt noted in some of the recent news, including the news just recently from Ford, that they're about to invest billions of dollars in battery factories and electric vehicle assembly lines. So we talk about risk, we talk about opportunities, and how climate science and climate research maps into those risks and opportunities, and how all of that maps into decision-making, the decision culture. Now, once we get into that ecosystem of investment, for example, or capital reallocation, to use a broader term, one of the issues is to determine how well you're doing. Are we actually meeting the goals? Are companies keeping to their promises to become carbon neutral? Are countries, our economies responding to the IPCC reports and the COP26 meeting about to happen in Glasgow with their nationally determined contributions to carbon reduction, these NDCs? How do we assess whether we're actually meeting those goals? What are the pathways to accomplishing a goal of net zero, as it were, or net negative carbon utilization? And will that actually have an impact on the degree of planetary warming that we think we're going to be experiencing? As you probably already realize, of course, and you probably already know, we've already experienced 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming since pre-industrial, well on our way to 1.5 degrees. If we do nothing else, we're going to blow through that. We're going to blow through 2 degrees C. We're probably going to blow through 3 degrees, 4 degrees C. So we'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. But we think the potential really is there to stay below 2 degrees C if we're reallocating capital. But to do that, we have to have goals. We have to monitor the progress toward those goals. And we have to build scenarios, the so-called net zero scenarios and pathways. And how do we assess whether we're on the right track? So one of the metrics that's used now in the SRI space, socially responsible investing space, is ESG, environment, social, governance, and so on. A lot of us, including our partners in the financial service sector, believe that S&G is really hard. Environment is a little bit easy, still hard, easier, but still hard. But the notion that we're beginning to see emerge in financial services is that ESG, in some sense, is complicated. There are many ways of measuring it. There are many players in the measurement space of ESG, in the rating space of ESG. Perhaps we ought to be concentrating on climate metrics more appropriately and more specifically. They themselves also are difficult to measure. But on the other hand, it focuses our attention on the promises that companies are making, the goals that nations are setting, and the reliance on some of these intergovernmental agreements, and frankly, sector level ways in which industry, the private sector, is evolving in response to the climate process as well. So when we talk about how to measure, how to assess, how to rate corporate performance, we'll be talking about the various ways in which we might be able to do carbon accounting, for example, which frankly is a frontier research area in our interdisciplinary research between the climate scientists and our business school and so on. Our accounting department, for example, in the Columbia Business School, is beginning to look very carefully at how to do carbon accounting. You've probably heard about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. These are we'll talk about specifically what those mean. But there's a lot of double accounting going on, even for one company. And then when you start aggregating those companies into a sector and aggregating the sectors into the private sector performance of a country, then aggregating the countries together, there's an enormous amount, an inherent amount of uncertainty in the way we do carbon accounting. That has to be cleared up. There are, again, a lot of players in that space, a lot of rating agencies, rating corporations in that space. But there's a lot of work to do to truly understand what is going on. So we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, we'll talk in some sense about the dialectic, if you will. There's a way in which we need to make the carbon transition, the low carbon transition, a just transition, in the sense that we can't deny sustainability opportunities for less developed countries, the global south. They owe their development to cheap energy. We can't deny them on just moral grounds their pathway to sustainability, their pathway to a better standard of living, but that's going to take energy. And how do we do that? So how do we rationalize? How do we characterize this dialectic, this debate between the need to achieve poverty reduction, the need to elevate the global south to a standard of living that is consistent with their goals and their own notion of where they need to go? And how do we achieve this in a just way that still meets the environmental goals that we have to have? So we'll end with that sort of discussion. There's no solution to that yet, by the way, but it has to be an element of the discussion. So we will have 7 sessions. We will spend the first 3 sessions on climate science, climate impacts, the issue of extremes. We'll talk about these risk taxonomies, these hazard taxonomies, ranging from how do we characterize sea level rise to what do we actually talk about when we're talking about extreme weather and climate, the so-called fat tail risks that are associated with extremes. We'll talk about changing probabilities for extreme events, for example, heat waves, coupling heat waves with humidity, high humidity, and what those impacts all mean. We'll be talking about the climate system in many ways. Then we'll turn to some of the technological solutions. We'll go through basically a high-level overview of what's happening in the battery space, in carbon sequestration, in alternative energy generation, alternative fuels. But then we'll spend a lot of time on ESG metrics, on carbon accounting, and how that applies, how those might be used to actually determine whether companies are adhering to their promises, whether countries can actually achieve the NDCs that they are setting in Glasgow, and whether we'll actually be on a net zero pathway, and what will be the scenarios associated with that. And then, of course, as I stated, we'll end with this discussion of, well, now that the global north has figured out what to do, I say somewhat in jest, but now that the global north has figured out what to do, how do we accommodate the poverty reduction and economic growth needs of the global South at the same time? It'll ultimately be some kind of redistribution of technology and wealth, but how can that be done in a just and a sane manner going forward? So that's a brief. You've seen some of the overviews that are on our website, of course, and I'd be happy to talk with you about any questions that you may have or discuss with you. So I see a question. Go ahead, Cassie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Art, you can look at the Q&A box, and I invite our attendees at this time to type your questions into that Q&A box for Art to address. And I see the 2 questions more about educational background required.
Sure. So I'll take them in order. So what is the educational level required for this course? You should have really kind of a basic understanding of statistics, because I'll be talking about things like normal distributions, about so-called Gaussian fat tails and things like that. But I don't expect you to have a strong quantitative background. We'll be using plain language to describe a lot of these effects and pieces of the problem. When we talk about climate science, my focus will be on what we know, what the models demonstrate, and I'll use the language that we use with our private sector partners, which is basically, here's what we know, here's what we can predict, here's what's unknown, here's what's uncertain, and so on. So you really don't need you don't need a mathematical background at all, but I think some understanding of what a probability is would help. Nirit Lotan asks, how suitable is this workshop for professionals without financial or investment background? And I'll be covering some investment basics. I should have stated that I'm going to ask a few of my colleagues from Columbia and our external partners to come in and talk about that. And we will talk about investment basics. What does it mean to have fixed income? What is a security or an equity? And the point is how do these various types of investments map into the decision space that we're creating by taking into account climate risks and opportunities and net zero pathways. So we'll be able to distinguish, say, between what it means for, say, a mortgage investment in an area prone to flood or sea level rise, versus what it means for an equity in the fossil fuels, or equity that might be, or an equity that might be impacted through a disruption of the supply chain as a consequence of climate change and extreme weather. So again, in generalities, but I will bring in folks, some of my colleagues who will be able to explain that on a basic level. We'll put together suggested preparatory reading, a few papers, a few articles. I would say between now and then, however, before we get that resource list out to you, just track what's happening in the news, because climate, again, when I say that that we're in a pivot, an era of pivoting, you can sense that simply by reading the front page of the newspaper, the Times or the Post, or whatever you want to read. Because it's front and center in a lot of discussions. So just by keeping track of what's happening through the news is one way to get prepared, but we will have a resource list going forward. And that resource list will be some of the primary literature, but will ensure that it's decipherable to a professional audience. The time commitments and some details about the time commitments and being able to have discussions about the topics, lots to learn. Well, each of the sessions, the 7 sessions, will be about 2 hours, typically about an hour and a half of discussion, lecturing, presentations. I happen to be I promote interaction whenever I teach a class, but the fundamental way in which I think we can gain a mutual understanding, and also given what I expect to be the heterogeneity, the different experiences that our participants will be bringing to the class, I want to promote a lot of interactive Q&A going forward. So I suggest that we will be spending about an hour where I or one of my colleagues will be talking to you and laying out some of the basics, the framework for a conversation. Then we'll have that conversation with you for about another 45 minutes or an hour. So I expect you to participate, of course, and I hope that you do. But I have found that we'll learn from each other as much perhaps as you might learn from myself and my colleagues. No homework, of course, violates one of my principles, but nevertheless, no homework. Will this course focus on U.S. domestic markets and policies or have a global perspective with respect to standards, frameworks, markets, etc.? So much is happening in the EU and in Asia Pacific region, in addition to what's happening within the United States, that we need to cover that because a lot of the investment discussion concerns global companies. So we will go over, as I said, some of the adjudicative and administrative issues. What are the policies, procedures? What are the legal liabilities? What are the, if you will, the court concern, the litigation going in front of national and international courts? What does that look like? So we'll give you kind of a taste of that environment, but in particular, we will be looking at ways in which Asia Pacific and the EU happen to be ahead of the United States, in some sense, thereby putting stress on international corporations that work in those markets as well. The United States is an interesting case because of, if you will, the proclivities and the idiosyncrasies of our political system with respect to climate. But we can look at some litigation within the US, as well as what companies are doing within the domestic markets and within the domestic space as well. In some sense, and we're getting this sense repeatedly from our partners outside the university, the private sector in the US is ahead of the US political system. Shouldn't be a surprise, frankly, but that's where we are. Bill Schnell asks, atmospheric scientists tend to have a rather pessimistic view of prospects for successfully meeting the challenges posed by climate change, often citing climate feedback loops that remove human control from the equation. Does the business quarter offer cause for optimism? And yes, it does. And not all climate scientists, about 50 of my colleagues here at Lamont, are pessimistic. We all believe that things can be done. What generally drives the pessimism, to put it mildly, are the idiosyncrasies of the US political system, to put it, to be kind in some way. But the way in which the private sector is reacting to this pivot, I think does in fact generate optimism. And in fact, when we see what's happening globally and the swift changes that are happening in Asia Pacific, China and its Belt Road Initiative, for example, limiting coal, the construction of new coal plants, for example. I think there is, in fact, global optimism that we can do this. Now, it's going to be a difficult path, obviously, and the coming up with the 80 to 160 trillion worth of investment is going to be, of course, a challenge. But if you look at the amount of capital that's under management in the markets, I think we can get there. So, yes, I'm not going to give you a doom and gloom scenario. You've had enough of that. Let's stipulate that there could be doom and gloom, but let's also stipulate that there are pathways that give us cause for optimism. Will the classes only be available on a live basis, or will it be an asynchronous option? We will be doing this on a live basis. The interaction, the Q&A is very important. Cassie, perhaps you can explain what we might be doing with recordings and so on.
Of course. So we will make the recordings available to everyone. We understand that work and life get in the way and things come up. And so we do For everyone who does register and participate, we do make the recordings available pretty much the next business day, or however long it takes Zoom to process a 2-hour recording. And then we also make those recordings available even after you've completed the workshop. So there's no limit on the number of times you can go back to revisit a discussion.
Are professionals under 18 permitted to attend? Which begs the question, is there any such thing as a professional younger than 18? Let me ask Cassie that question.
So we typically have reserved these professional learning workshops for adults. We have separate offerings for pre-college students, and we've done those pretty intentionally to ensure that the level of interactions with the participants are appropriate, and we make there's other processes that our instructors and training that our instructors have to undergo to teach to a younger audience. So typically we have not made the professional learning programs available to learners under 18.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you very much to all of our participants. You're going to hear from me tomorrow. I will share a recording of this info session as well, along with additional information for how you sign up, reduced rate options that are available. And if any of you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to myself. And Art, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, but thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you do sign up, of course, but the importance of this discussion is all about what society can do as a whole, and how the university engages is one way in which we one way in which we engage with society is in fact by having these sorts of discussions with you. And the whole point is that there has to be a recognition more globally that this is a mode of operation that is necessary to get into. So I hope to see you again, and thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon and evening. Bye-bye.